So today we got as a speaker Tom Landstreet. He's the co-founder of Telltale Capital Corp. It's a registered investment advisor. And he's also the CEO of Standard Research. Formerly, he worked with Art Laffer in economic research. Before that, he was with Avondale and as well as SunTrust Robinson Humphrey in Atlanta. And I think really more interesting when he was in New York and young in his career, he was a stand-up comedian. So I don't know. And I actually really like this part of it. He's married with 3 children and currently resides in Nashville, Tennessee, one of 9 states with no income tax. I'm sure Art would be really proud that you put that on there. So, and with no further ado, Tom Landstreet.
It's kind of a weak applause. We try it again. Now it's intimidating. Can you dial it back a notch? No, I'm just kidding. You know, I knew I'd been to this bar before when I walked in the front door, but I couldn't figure out where. It's kind of a happening bar, actually. I don't know if you all know that here. Very happening. I walked in the door, confused. I was like, I know I've been here. I was just thinking there for a minute. And the bartender walked up and said, Mr. Landstreet, we have your credit card from last night. And I knew I'd been here and stuff. But, that's not true, I made that up. But anyway, thanks for having me. I've been to a few ACG events. I've spoken in Memphis, San Francisco, spoken to the New York chapter. My brother Bev Landstreet, who's here, ran Intergrowth in Phoenix a few years ago, and my former boss Arthur Laffer was the speaker. And so I'm very familiar with the organization. I'm very impressed with the organization nationally. Each of the divisions, it's unbelievable to witness ACG at work in like Intergrowth, and then each of the branches. They're very organized, they're very energetic. They're always doing programs. I just wish I was cool enough to be a member, but I can speak to it, and so that's why I'm here. I'm going to talk about a few things here regarding tax policy, really regarding government policy and how it rearranges GDP in thousands of ways that we may or may not be aware of. In the area, of course, I worked for Arthur Laffer for 5 years, so I'm going to pepper my talk with supply side free market economics, if you don't mind. Before that, I did some stand-up comedy. I was a rock drummer. I was on theater. Went to New York and was working for a division of Ogilvy and Mather. It was an English major, and started editing research, equity research at night, and kind of fell in love with it, and saw a friend of mine who was formerly a derelict just knocking the lights out on Wall Street. And I was like, man, if that guy can do it, I know I can. So I was like, I got to get in this area and make some real money. And of course, when I went to interview on Wall Street, they looked at my resume, English literature, 19th century literature, what? Stand-up comedian and catch a rising star. I mean, that was a hell of a club, but it didn't translate. I couldn't buy my way into a job. I was in Atlanta. And so finally, this one nice gentleman by the name of Fontaine McDaniel kept allowing me to come back and pitch my wares to him, although he wouldn't hire me, just dragging his feet, but he let me come back a lot, so of course I wore him out. I remember one day I came to him, I lied and said, Fontaine, let me tell you something. I've had a good career. I've made some money, okay? I'll work for free. I'll sweep around the trading desk. I'll do anything to get into business. I'll work for free. Waited. And he said he'd think about it. I was like, the guy has to think about me working for free. That's unbelievable. So the next day he calls me up and he says, Tom, we've decided to hire you. We can offer you $60,000. I was so pumped up. I said, my wife says I have to have 65. He said, okay. I had a job. I got the 65. I got the 5,000 extra. Then I moved over to Robinson Humphrey, which was the white shoe firm in the Southeast back then. And right when I got hired, I'm tenuous. Remember, I'm tenuous on Wall Street. This is my first kind of foray into the business. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm in institutional equity sales. And the guy that hired me took a risk on me, retired. Moments after I joined the firm, I'm like one of 25 salesmen. I know nothing. I'm in this corner office way in the back. And I kept trying to get an appointment with the guy who was the number 2, now number 1, head of sales, and he wouldn't take the time to meet with me. And it took literally over a month to get an appointment with my boss. Of course, I'm panicking. I feel like I'm on the fringes again. I'm at risk, they're going to make me go back to something else. And so I befriended his secretary at the time. I was keep bringing her treats and so forth. And finally I said, listen, here's the deal. I got to get to know Bill Joe. I can't get an appointment. I've got to do something. I know he's going to New York next week. Can you tell me his schedule? She said, sure. I've been bringing her treats. So we conspired. I got his schedule. I knew his flights. I knew where we were staying. I went and booked everything. So I'm in New York. I have no business there except for this, to meet my boss. That's edgy. He didn't know. So anyway, I called him up at the right time. It was planned with the assistance of his assistant. And I said, hey, Bill, Tom Landstreet. Instantly apologized for not being able to see me. I'm so sorry. I've been so busy. I know you've been trying to see me. I'm really sorry. Gosh, and I'm in New York. I can't see you now. And I said, I'm in New York too. What a coincidence. He goes, really? Where are you? I said, Intercontinental Hotel. He says, so am I. What a coincidence. And I said, yeah, well, what are you doing right now? He goes, well, I have a 2-hour window. And of course, I've got a schedule there. Can I come down and visit with you? He said, sure. It was room 1701. I was on the 19th floor. I was there in seconds. Walked in that. He stayed a lot at the Intercontinental, and he had I'll never forget this, a grand piano in his hotel room. He was upgraded clearly, and I walked in there, and my grandmother had a grand piano. These things are big, right? And I was like, this is why I want to be on Wall Street, stay in a hotel with a grand piano. I was so excited. So anyway, it was during that session that I really introduced myself to my boss, and I pitched like mad. I just told him the whole story and how I'd eat the phone for breakfast and this and that and the other. He loved it. Loved it. So I knew I wasn't going to lose my job when I got back to Atlanta. But I still didn't feel, I had no clients. But the boss knew me. He said hello to me in the hallway. I still feel like an orphan. So I went to an airline conference in New York that was hosted by Robinson Humphrey. And Bill Joe had been in the restroom, and I passed him in the hallway. And he goes, hey, Landstreet. Yes, sir. I found this on the bathroom floor. It's your first lead. And he goes walking into the conference. And I'm like, wow, this is edgy. That's a real lead. Anyway, I got back to Atlanta, and I called those people every second. I wore them out. It was my only lead. Well, I got a huge trade like 3 weeks later. Very large trade. I'll never forget it. Office Depot at $16. They wanted like 500,000 shares back then. That was a big deal. I didn't even know how to fill out the trade ticket. I did it all wrong. Traders are animals. I don't know how many of y'all have been on a trading desk. They think they're fighter pilots. They're not. They're monkeys. Wait, that's a little aggressive, but they're order taker. Well, no, that's not it either. But they do think they're cool. So I go there with this ticket all it wasn't filled out correctly, and the guy just threw it at me. Said, go fill it out correctly. I went to the secretary. Can you help me do this? And so I got it right. I got the order done, and that became a huge client of Robinson Humphrey. And finally, Bill jumped at a morning meeting when we were going through the morning, stock ideas and so forth. Said, Tom, can you stand up, please? I gave this guy a business card, really just kidding around about a month ago, and we're getting a lot of orders. So can you guys get busy? And then I became a pariah, because I'm making other people look bad. But I tell that story because I travel. I give a lot of talks at colleges and high schools and so forth. I was at Sewanee last night. And I tell kids, you know what, to be successful, persist. Be there an hour early, stay an hour late, eat the phone for breakfast, never give up. No matter how unorthodox your background is, no matter how intimidated you are by the other side, don't ever give up. I am living proof that you can get anywhere you want just by persisting and being aggressive. I don't know why I'm telling you all that. You're all successful, but I've been speaking at Vanderbilt, I've been speaking at some high schools and so forth, so I'm kind of like on this motivational thing. But today I want to talk about economics. And I want to talk about what I learned at Laffer. I became a pretty good stock picker over my career. Understand the company, what makes it tick. I can look at a CEO and tell if they're lying or full of it or whatever. But Laffer taught me something entirely new, and that is to understand that the government is the 800-pound gorilla in any city, state, country, or industry. And that you really have to focus on government economic policy as they rearrange GDP in thousands of ways. And I'm going to show you some charts in a minute that I think are positively shocking. We all kind of know this, but to put it into your investment analysis, it can be quite helpful. I publish a research product to hedge funds and mutual funds where I just focus on this. I come up with ideas where I'm looking at government policies and then kind of going to connecting the dots. It's called, I connect the dots between the policy and the incentive effect and the stocks. And I also am a partner in a small money management firm where we will put some of the portfolio into some thematic trading and groups of stocks which are driven by a lot of what I'll talk about today. So, Laffer taught me to look at government in the four he called them the four grand kingdoms of macroeconomics: monetary policy, fiscal policy, which is tax and spend, trade policy, which of course is protectionism versus free trade, and then what he calls income policies, but really are regulatory policies. It would be Obamacare or the Environmental Protection Agency or the thousands of little regulations that we deal with every day in every industry. And we all know about CMS and how they control reimbursements in healthcare. We all know Sarbanes-Oxley did wonders for the private equity business and pretty much put small investment banks out of business, and the IPOs, the number of IPOs is reduced and so on. We know that stuff. But do we know the other areas where government completely changes the landscape for investments and for companies itself? And so I'm going to go through a couple. I'm going to talk about fiscal policy, specifically tax policy, and specifically temporary tax credits. A few years ago, in 2011, there was a rule in place which we thought was fairly significant that nobody really was paying attention to. It was the 100% bonus depreciation rule. This rule allowed companies to accelerate depreciation. In fact, if we were a company and we bought a big piece of equipment, we could depreciate 100% of that purchase with no thresholds, no caps. I mean, no limits, 100% of it the year we purchased it. So I was sitting around thinking, well, that's a huge incentive to buy now, right? I wonder where in the economy this is going to be. And the more I poked and prodded, I realized it was everywhere. It was like oxygen. As an investor and as an analyst, I couldn't figure out exactly where the action would be in stocks. But eventually I got there by continuing to question. And I was speaking to a BDO conference, and there were a bunch of treasurers and CFOs in the audience. And I'm going through tax policy. And I talk about the bonus, and I ask, is anybody aware of the accelerated or 100% bonus depreciation rule? Could you raise your hand? All the hands went up. Then I asked, are any of your clients of your accountancy, are they taking advantage of this? All the hands stayed up. I said, okay, keep your hand up if you have a client or some clients that are buying stuff that they would not ordinarily buy immediately. They may have a need, but they're buying it now because of this. 60% of the hands remained up. And I was like, I'm on to something. So I spoke in Louisville to a BDO and I did the same thing. It was almost the same percentage. 60% of the hands stayed up when I asked, do you have clients buying stuff that they may not need now? So then I was like, I've got to find where this is moving the needle. So my son's a Sewanee boy. I've become friends with this big farmer from Memphis. I call him up. I'm thinking, you know what? I've got a farmer cousin. He's tight as a tick when it comes to money. And, farmer incomes are illusory. One drought can knock them out completely. So when times are good, they cover. They're very tax efficient is what I want to say. And they really are. I mean, you can have a multi-millionaire farmer in dungarees with holes in them. You never know, right? They drive a pickup truck. They're notorious. And so I was like, maybe that's it. So I called my buddy. I said, are you taking advantage of this? He said, yeah, you ought to call my accountant. Great. Call his accountant. I said, let me ask you a few questions. How many of your clients? Everybody's doing it. How do you know what I'm going to say? Lawrence told me what you're going to say. Everybody's doing it. And I was like, dang it, I'm on it. And I was like, well, tell me about that a little more. He says, I'm telling people don't buy stuff you don't need. And I just hung up. Okay, I know it. It's the farmer. So then I did a little more work. I called CPAs all over the country, in Des Moines, Iowa, and Washington, Spokane, Washington. I kept talking to this guy, and I realized, you know what? Farmers had 3 record years of profits. Okay, remember, profits are illusory in the Farm Belt. So, and they're very tax efficient. And I decided, wow, Caterpillar, John Deere, Cummins engine, what else? You know, what big ticket durable good is going to, well, I'm going to show you some charts. And I'm going to show you how a policy, a temporary policy that nobody was really aware of, totally moved the needle on a number of stocks. And it is visible. And so, if you don't mind, Jane, this is Caterpillar, but I think, can you go to the first slide, is John Deere? No? Okay, all right, so here we are. I publish papers on this stuff, and I got a bunch of hedge funds and mutual funds who pay me for this niche kind of thinking. They want to know where the deep, fast part of the river is. I think I can find it by understanding the 800-pound gorilla and so forth. So I published my paper here with this is a crude representation, forgive the handwriting, but I wanted to make a point. Are you going to Deere? Okay, well, it's the same story every time. So I happen to, yeah, there we go. So I publish in here, it's October, November. My speeches with BDO were back in June. I'm thinking about this for months and months and months, trying to figure out what to do. I looked at waste management, I looked at the big telecom companies, because they're huge CapEx spenders. I couldn't figure out how to invest. But when I got down to the farm sector, I knew exactly what I knew I'd hit, I guess, pay dirt. And what you can see here is that they had a heck of a fourth quarter of 2011, and that all the stocks did. And when they put up their fourth quarter earnings numbers, they were huge. Deere represents it to some degree. You can see that's the fourth quarter earnings release. Deere had a great run, kind of collapsed in front of it, and then really collapsed afterwards, okay? Because the first quarter demand dried up completely. Can you go to the next one? Caterpillar's a poster child for it. Big, Cummins engine. They make giant engines. They go into everything. Cummins engine sells to every of the combine companies, all the bulldozer companies, all the industrial equipment. They're big ticket, heavy equipment, durable goods. Look at that chart. Does that look like a tent? And look at the lines. The bonus depreciation rule ends, the fourth quarter earnings release. It had one little leg up, and it was down 35% within a matter of months. And by the way, it was up 35% in 2 months before that. This is a tradable event. You can go long and short this like, shooting fish in a barrel. Titan Equipment. Titan's a U.S. retailer of Case New Holland. 89 stores. We sell big stuff. And of course, Cummins engine and John Deere and Caterpillar are international businesses. So I had to worry about China and Brazil. They weren't a pure play. This was a pure play. Look at the fourth quarter earnings release. Look how that stock shot up when they reported a 12-cent beat on the fourth quarter. Oh, and look what happened afterwards. It was in the first quarter, demand dried up. It was all pulled forward by this giant stimulus. I mean, people respond to incentives every single time. You mind, Frank, anymore? Caterpillar, another poster child for this pull forward. Need I say more? To a hedge fund, that is like nirvana. And by the way, I'm on a diatribe to tell investors, put this in your purview. It's amazingly effective to try to figure out how the government's rearranging incentives, because this was just a simple pull forward. I'll give you another example of this. Dividend tax rates went up on January 1st, personal income tax rates and capital gains tax rates. So about October, my partner here, Frank, and I were thinking about, wow, what would we do? We pay special dividends. Somebody's going to pay special dividends in front of the big increase in. So we screened a bunch of stocks, and of course we were trying to figure out what criteria to use. Of course, because people respond to incentives, we thought insider ownership would be the biggest, naturally, the biggest incentive. And so we screened stocks for very large insider ownership, both breadth and depth. You'll laugh at this. Our screens are automated, but they didn't catch this part, but we looked for Republicans. Red state ballots. Sheldon Adelson, the big Romney supporter, he paid the biggest dividend of all the companies. 480 companies announced special dividends in December alone versus 140 in the prior year. 4x, okay? And it was all a pull forward. It was all predictable. It's just people responding to, incentives. And I love this Sheldon Adelson. He just wants to give a finger to the government. That was a no-brainer. But he was one of the first ones to announce it, so we missed him. But we screened, like I said, 1,500 dividend-paying stocks. We found 20 hot ones. Bought 10, 4 of them announced. Leggett & Platt, Flowers Industries, announced special dividends. And by the way, they were doozies. And the stocks were up 10 points in the day they announced. And it was awesome. And it was predictable, 100% predictable. It's nice when you can make an investment and feel good at night because you know human behavior. It never changes. And so that's kind of 2 examples of how tax rates and what I call tax boundaries can generate behavior in advance of and afterwards. And how if you put this in your purview, at least as a public equity investor, you can really, make some money and kind of sleep at night with that part of your portfolio because you know human nature. I'm going to go into, of course, the fiscal side of the equation. You've got the tax and the spend and the debt, right? So fiscal policy has a double-edged sword. The debt side of it's a little tougher, but what I do know is the stimulus programs and what the Fed's doing, especially the stimulus, that stuff has a cost. I know they're all a bunch of demand-siders and they think they can spill $800 billion and send Joe Sixpack a check for $600 and they actually think he's going to go out and spend it, and that dollar that he gets, that $600, there's going to be a 2.3 times multiplier to that. I heard Jared Bernstein, who's always on Kudlow, he was the vice president's chief economist, argued with me that dollar he spends in a stimulus magically turns to $2.3. I tell you what, I'm a simple-minded man. I don't get where that happens. In fact, I would think there's a certain friction to that, that the dollar probably turns into 85 cents. Guess what it did? They didn't go out and spend that $800 billion. Whenever the government stimulates, there's a big cost. It reminds me, I'll tell the story, of the hunter and his dog that were out on the hunting trail in the Yukon. They were out for a couple of weeks. It had been a sparse hunting trip. They were starving around the campfire one night. It was getting rough. And the cold air, the fire, the hunter couldn't take it anymore. He calls over his faithful dog, who comes over and they cuddle, pulls out his Bowie knife, cuts off the dog's tail, throws it on the fire to boil. He's desperate. It's done. He eats what he can of the tail, pitches it to the dog, who devours the remainder of it in gratitude, and comes and licks the hunter's hand. That's the story of federal aid. Is that too dark? I can lighten it up. There's a cost, is what I want to say, to federal aid. I'm going to get into the monetary policy because that's really what's driving the equity markets, in our opinion. Specifically, you've got the fiscal cliff, which the markets have just yawned at. You've got Europe in a double-dip recession. Spain, 6 quarters of negative growth. Okay, France now raising their hand and saying we're not going to meet our covenants. And Cyprus, Europe's still a huge issue. And again, we got the fiscal cliff unresolved. But the markets don't seem to care. Are we all looking at each other? Don't you go home and when's the market going to reflect this? I'll tell you why the market's not reflecting it. Because of the Federal Reserve. On September 9th, right in front of the election, they announced an $85 billion monthly purchase program consisting, as you know of, $45 billion a month in treasuries, $40 billion a month in mortgage-backed securities. That $40 billion a month in mortgage-backed securities is a rifle shot right at housing, right at the consumer, unfortunately and also right at the election. At the time, I was saying this is the biggest campaign donation I've ever seen. Of course, I'm a cynic, but I'm going to show you some charts of what that purchase. Now, keep in mind, the Fed's balance sheet was $958 billion 4 years ago. It just passed $3 trillion. And if they follow up on their threat to keep the current policies intact until they reach 6.5% unemployment, we're at 7.9. I did the math. At the current rate of job growth, monthly job growth, that's at 18 months out times 85 billion a month equals 1.4 trillion of new on top of the $3 trillion balance sheet. My point is it's big. It's big upon big. It's big times 1,000. It's unprecedented in history times it's just so, well, anyway, I'm going to show you some charts. What I knew when they did that was the housing sector, I didn't make money on it, but I knew the housing sector was going to perk up big time, and boy, did it. So Frank, can you move? All right, so this is the S&P, okay, over a long period of time from '05. And you can see where, of course, it collapsed, 07, '08. This was the first mortgage-backed security program in March 2009. And you can see what it did to the market. It stopped a serious draft and turned it right in the other direction. And the gray line is when their mortgage-backed security assets peaked and they took a breather in their buying program and they went into Operation Twist, I'm sure you've heard of it and so forth. And then the market starts fading again in front of the election. Boom, they do in September, the second mortgage-backed security program, which is bigger than all of them. I mean, it was very big. And you can see what the market did. So that's just the S&P. So I want to tell you, I did the math. The stock market right now is 0.45 correlation to Fed's actions, which is very high. In the past, you couldn't even find a correlation. So they are driving the market. They are why it's yawning in the face of the fiscal cliff and so forth. But we got more here. These are emerging markets. So what the Fed's doing is making it painful to own anything other than risk assets. You can't own munis, you can't own corporates, you can't own treasuries, obviously. You can't own gold, it's going down, right? Even though there's an inflation threat, gold's collapsing. They have been very effective through this giant program in chasing investors into the only thing working, which is equities. And by the way, when they buy treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, they're buying it through 7 money center banks, okay? It's a direct shot in the arm to the capital markets through the money center banks. I mean, it is a morphine drip, is like the way I put it. They got the markets on the morphine drip. So, of course, we can see what they've done to emerging markets. Emerging markets have outperformed the S&P since the last mortgage-backed security program was enacted in September. It's just a point that they've chased people out on the risk curve into even emerging markets, and that the emerging markets have actually outperformed the S&P in the midst of this. Some would argue that they're actually more sound, many of these emerging markets, than the U.S. They have lower debt levels, they have higher growth levels, better demographics, but nonetheless, it is out on the risk curve. They are chasing investors there aggressively, and it's working. All right, this is the housing sector, ticker HGX. It's an ETF. So when I invest, I'm kind of a long investor. I don't really short, but I will sometimes short an index if I feel like something's going to be squirrely. I can get a whole basket of stocks with an ETF. I'll usually do a 1-for-1, like a 1-for-1 negative ETF, not leveraged, is my point. So you can see what the housing sector was coming down here aggressively. They enacted the first mortgage-backed security program, your first red line there. Then you've got the gray line, was when they pulled back on the program, again went into Operation Twist, etc. You can see how the index languished in that period and started to fade. They do this last mortgage-backed security program, and of course we know how the housing sector has done, housing stocks have done in 2012, especially the latter half. They are on fire, and they remain on fire. Home Depot and Lowe's at all-time highs, Beacon Roofing. The peripheral stocks to the housing sector, the service companies, and unbelievable performance. By the way, it's not fundamentals at all. It's the rifle shot. They're buying, last week they bought $20 billion in mortgage-backed securities. I checked the weekly Fed data. $20 billion, they say it's $40 billion a month, but they did 20 in a week. Pretty aggressive. By the way, they're buying newly minted paper. This isn't the old stale stuff they were buying back here in the first line. They're buying newly created loans, TBA loans they call them. They're brand new. They're buying everything. And here's what's interesting. I'm a stock buyer. I like to buy stocks when they're down, okay, theoretically sell them when they're up. The Fed's purpose in buying is not to buy them low, but to buy them high, to actually create a higher price. Wouldn't you love that kind of buyer buying from you? I would love to sell my house to somebody who wants the price to be higher. They can top tick the neighborhood, because that's what the Fed's doing. It is no more complex than that. So you got to ask, what's next? Wow. I mean, the Fed just, 2 days ago said, well, maybe we'll slow this down sometime, and this market's taking a breather. My guess is, and I'm watching this like a hawk, when they even hint that they're going to slow down this mortgage-backed security program, these stocks are going to get creamed. They are 100% correlated with Fed action. There is no fundamental driver of this. And this is another policy of the four grand kingdoms, with their tax, monetary policy, where you can play it as an investor. The other, the trade policy is another one. It's a little less consequential, but it's very important. Free trade versus protectionism. Some years ago I read where China had enacted a free trade agreement with their Asian neighbors. It was called CAFTA, China ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. ASEAN was the seven countries of the ASEAN nations: Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, and there's smaller Southeast Asian nations. They had significant tariffs to the tune of 20% on everything traded, and they basically phased those out over a 5-year period to zero. And I was reading about this and I thought, wow, frictionless trade. Whereas before it cost 20% to trade goods between these countries, these high growth countries in Southeast Asia. I'm a supply sider. I think that's pretty darn stimulative, right? I got pretty excited. And I started looking, well, what do you own? I mean, gosh, something's going to take off here. And I started looking at the Philippines and Indonesia. I was like, mahogany in Indonesia, palm oil in the Philippines. I'm not that big a speculator, but I found a way to play it. Singapore. Singapore doesn't make anything, and they trade everything. They're a free trade nation. That's all they do since like 1,000 years. So I simply bought the ETF representing Singapore, and Singapore put up a 14.9% GDP growth rate the year after CAFTA was finalized. 14.9% growth rate for a country. Find me a company growing that fast, I'll be very excited. I guess the point is this. These policies make a big difference in the real world. 14.9% GDP growth for a country is no small matter. And so you can find these things. The question is always, what's it going to do? What do I own, what I don't own? And so that's what you have to kind of figure out, put your thinking hat on. I'll go one more and then I'll be happy to answer questions. But recently, I know you can do this. This framework works for big stuff like monetary and tiny stuff. Recently, we read where there was a settlement between the credit card companies Visa and MasterCard and several associations representing restaurants and retailers, the American Restaurant Association. It was a settlement whereby they changed the rules and allowed restaurants and retailers to pass on the credit card surcharge and the interchange fee, which is pretty pricey, to the consumer. And all they got to do is disclose it on the receipt and have a little sign by the register. Okay, the deal is this. Retailers are getting socked with 1 to 4% surcharge on every transaction. That's why some of them don't take American Express and some prefer cash. And so this, for the first time ever, allows a retailer to, Visa, I'm passing it on. Okay, because this is margin. Now, Frank and I talked about that. Frank kept, and I was doubting it because I got on the phone with some friends of mine in the retail industry, the restaurant, and they're like, no way, they're not gonna do that. And Frank kept saying, Tom, do people still respond to incentives? Or has something changed in the last 1,000 years? And he kept saying that. I was like, you're right. You're right, this is a big deal. But I kept getting such negative feedback from other investors and participants in the real economy. And I was, well, guess what? There were a couple of names that we wrote a paper about, and we screened for several names that we thought would benefit. And the idea is this. If it becomes more expensive to use a credit card, on the margin, more people will be using cash, especially in an economy that is not that great, and jobless is where it is. People are counting their pennies. So if they know they're going to be socked with a 2% fee by the retailer or restaurant, they might choose their debit or just pay cash. Okay, on the margin, we thought it's going to mean something over time. Frank actually found where Australia changed the rules 10 years ago, and now 40% of the merchants charge the surcharge to their customers. What if 40% of the merchants do that here? We were like, wow, this is huge, a switch back to cash. Remember, we're going to a cashless society? This is going to provide a bump in the road to that. So we screened companies that we thought might be interesting, and those are prepaid cards and debit card processors, and even ATM machine operators and network operators. And we wrote about it, and we said these stocks are candidates to buy. Okay, and these are candidates to not buy or to sell. And then just 2 days ago, Total System Services out of Columbus, Georgia, a big credit card processor, purchased one of the top two names that we mentioned. The stock was up 30% in a day, and it's called net spend, and it's a total confirmation of what we figured out was that people respond to incentives. This does move the needle. This is a big deal. Boom, the stock was gone, and all the stocks that we highlighted are just taken off. And I guess it's just even in the little things like that. Just know people respond to incentives every single time. If you're in Bangladesh or Nashville, it doesn't matter. It's the same story. It's the same framework. And the government defines incentives. And those four kingdoms, monetary, fiscal, trade, and regulatory policy, you can use them as a template to invest. So it's kind of what I wanted to say today. I'm going to close with one little story, if you don't mind. And then I'll be glad to answer questions. But I've been speaking, I'm a guest lecturer at Vanderbilt, where I can take these little lines of mush and sharpen them up. And I speak at other schools and so forth. And I told this story because it turns out the economics professor that asked me to speak to his lab was an atheist. He told me that. And so I said, look, I know this atheist economics professor, just like you. One day he was walking through the Appalachians by himself on a beautiful, crisp Saturday afternoon. It was a gorgeous day. And of course, like a professor, he was completely lost in his thoughts, thinking about evolution, the power of nature, just lost. And he hears a rustling in the woods next to him. He looks over, and a big black bear comes out of the woods and starts chasing him down the path. Of course, he runs like a professor does, like this. And he can't run. He's knock kneed. He's got pens and calculators falling out. The bear's catching him. He looks over his shoulder. The bear's catching him. He's running as fast as he can. He trips on a stump, falls to the ground, scuttles over on his back to see the bear, claws fully extended, about to take his head off. And the atheist professor from Vanderbilt yelled, "Oh my God!" Right then time stopped and the bear froze. And a voice came from the heavens. "Ha ha ha! You've forsaken me all these years. You've told students, thousands of them, that I don't exist, and you want me to help you now." Professor was up the creek. He's like, "Well, sir, I guess it'd be a little insincere, to ask you to turn me into a God-fearing Christian now, but could you turn the bear into a Christian?" God said, "Very well." The bear reanimated, put his paws together, and said, "Bless this food I'm about to receive." That's it. That's all I got. I would like to answer some questions if you have any, though, about anything.
Hey, Tom, how's the Fed going to unwind this balance sheet? And what are the repercussions?
I don't care. I'm moving to Taiwan where they have 15% flat tax rates. No, I'm kidding. They say they're going to phase them out. They're going to slow down the buying in a sequential manner, not do it all at once. I can't imagine how they can remove this much money from the system, except for they can raise the reserve requirements, because a lot of this money is at the Federal Reserve. So they could raise the reserve requirements, and that would lock the money up essentially. They could maybe pay more for deposits at the Fed. Right now they pay a quarter point. But first they got to wind down the buying. If you want to ask me what you think the market's going to do when they do that, just think about the last 2 days when they just breathed that they might not buy these, they may slow down. I think you're going to see a correction because I think this market is 100% correlated with Fed action. And so that's the problem. They've made it, they are the market now. And when they do change course, it's going to be a big hiccup for the market. So there's several ways they can do it. But I got another chart in a paper I wrote, cleverly entitled Control P for print. It's about the Fed and printing. Control P being the keyboard command for print. And it goes through some of the charts, but it really, with the amount of money they've created and the Fed's balance sheet, they can support an economy about 5 times our size. If you look at the correlation between the Fed balance sheet and GDP. So I don't know the future. I'm scared of it though.
I'm curious, in your 100% depreciation example, how did you go about estimating what that bump period would be before they started going down? How long was it?
Well, it was a tough thing to kind of micromanage. All I was going on is it's happening big time, and there's a deadline. I remember shortly after Christmas into the new year, where the stocks, some of them were continuing to go up, and people were telling me I was wrong, and I started kind of panicking and thinking, oh no, I've fantasized this whole thing. But then, boom, my guess was on the fourth quarter earnings reported thereafter. I didn't know that. I thought maybe it would be instead of the fourth quarter earnings report, maybe the first quarter of 2012 report. But they started coming down quicker than I thought. And by the way, they continued down through the summer. Those charts only show part of it. They were down 35% through July and August. Timing is tough. And with these big things, timing is tough. But you got to just remember, people respond to incentives. They never change. They're so predictable, of course.
So Obamacare is the mother lode of incentives and disincentives. How do you play that over time?
You know, I've not played it. I'm scared. I don't even know what to do with it. I tried to read it, and I was cross-eyed. You know, and I read stuff like that for a living, and it's just so overwhelming. You know, I know obviously the hospitals have done great because, you know, HCA or whatever, they write off 10% of the revenues in indigent care or bad debt, right? So it's an automatic 10% revenue boost to them, all margin, stocks reflected 100%. They don't reflect the downward pressure in reimbursements that's bound to happen, but that's a few years out. We're just loving life right now. Another thing was the stimulus contained a lot of money for them. They gave to hospitals so they can upgrade their IT systems, as you know, and create medical records. That was a huge boon to the IT businesses. That too will wind down big time. And then there's the insurance companies. You may know this, but health insurance companies are now like utilities. They're capped in what they can make. For every dollar of premium that they get in from their clientele, they have to spend about 85% of it in medical expenditures, direct medical expenses. So in other words, their margin is capped at 15% gross, okay? They're capped in what they can make, but you know what isn't capped? Their risk. If they stumble into a giant population of diabetics, they're cooked. None of the actuarial tables work anymore because they're capped in what they can earn, you know, off each premium dollar. And so I think they are a huge risk. Probably going to go away. And maybe that was the intention of the writers of the legislation. But that's not a business you can be in. And that's why they're buying everything that moves and wiggles and crawls outside of their industry. You know, WellPoint bought the Medicaid administrator in Texas recently. They're diversifying like nobody's business. I'm watching this, and I don't know how to play it, but those are some ways that I'm noticed. Come on, one more.
Hey, Tommy, I heard you speak a couple months ago, and you were accurately bearish on Apple. Do you continue that position?
No, I bought it.
You bought it.
It broke 500. Figured maybe I better inch in.
On what metrics? Why?
Well, they got more cash than some countries. They got a low teens multiple. They are everywhere. Our house has 5 Apples and iPhones. I mean, we're all 100% Apple. You go to a business meeting now, there's tons of Apples. You know, there's some threat from maybe the Google Chrome and so forth, but, you know, they're ubiquitous. So I think it's overdone. I mean, it's a story stock. It's taking a beating. You know, CNBC's all over it. They'll all dry up at some point. They'll put up a good number, and it's back to the races. So thank you for acknowledging that. I was skeptical of Apple when my peer on the panel was really bulled up, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not so bulled up. And, you know, but hey, that was, 125 points higher. You know, and so everything at a price. Tim Cook's an Auburn grad, but I too, Auburn grad, but, that's why I bought it, really. No, I'm just kidding. Come on. No more? Yeah, please.
Any thoughts on what's going to happen March 1st?
You ever play kick the can? I don't think they have the guts to do anything. I can't imagine. I don't know how this is going to be settled. The president doesn't want to do anything, and Rand Paul's saying, I don't know. I think they kick the can. And the Fed's going to continue, and we're going to be on thin ice, but skating happily, It's a little scary. I can't, I think, like I said, I think they kicked the can. Is that it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It was great as always, and we'll be sure to have you back in a couple of years on your rotation. So thanks a lot. Thank you for all for coming. I hope y'all stick around. We still have some more beverages and food, and enjoy yourself.
Well,